The morning sun streamed through the windows of J.D. Vance's modest Washington apartment as he packed his overnight bag. Just a regular guy at heart, despite his growing fame. He glanced at the framed photo on his nightstand, his grandparents standing proudly in front of their small Appalachian home, and smiled. Those roots kept him grounded even as his life had taken such an unexpected turn. "Don't forget your speech notes," his wife called from the kitchen, the smell of fresh coffee filling their home. "Got 'em right here," J.D. replied, patting his leather messenger bag. The bag was a gift from his old buddies back home when he'd won the Senate race. Worn at the edges now, just like the work boots he'd worn during summer jobs in his youth. The journey from his hardscrabble childhood to the halls of power still felt surreal sometimes. Growing up, dinner had sometimes been whatever his grandmother could cobble together from nearly empty cupboards. College had seemed like an impossible dream back then, let alone Yale Law School. But here he was, a United States Senator, heading back to Ohio for a hometown speech. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant, "Car arriving in 15. Safe travels." J.D. looked out the window at the capital city below. Though he worked among the powerful now, he still felt like an outsider sometimes. The polished politicians with their perfect smiles and rehearsed answers, that wasn't him. He spoke plainly, sometimes too bluntly for Washington tastes, but people back home appreciated his honesty. The success of his book had caught everyone by surprise, most of all J.D. himself. He'd simply wanted to tell the story of his people, the forgotten folks in small towns across America struggling with job loss, addiction, and broken dreams. He never expected it would touch so many hearts or launch him into the national spotlight. As he zipped up his bag, J.D. thought about the speech he'd be giving tonight. Not the usual political fluff, but hard truths about rebuilding communities and second chances. He believed in second chances more than most. His own life was living proof that your past doesn't have to determine your future. The cab ride to Reagan National Airport was quick, the driver chatting about the unseasonably warm weather and asking about J.D.'s travel plans. Heading home to Ohio, J.D. said simply, not mentioning he was a senator. He preferred these normal interactions where he was just another traveler. At the airport, a few people did double takes as they recognized him, some smiling and nodding, others frowning slightly. That was the reality of public life. You couldn't please everyone, and J.D. had never tried to. His straight talk had won him both devoted supporters and fierce critics. After making his way through security, J.D. settled into a chair at his gate, scrolling through messages on his phone. A text from his grandmother made him chuckle. She still couldn't quite believe her grandson was a senator and worried about him getting a big head. No chance of that with family like his keeping him in check. Boarding the plane, J.D. found his seat in first class, a necessary comfort for his tall frame on frequent flights between D.C. and Ohio. As the other passengers filed past, J.D. gazed out the window, mentally rehearsing key points from his upcoming speech, completely unaware that in just minutes, this routine flight would become anything but ordinary. He closed his eyes briefly, thinking of the people he'd be speaking to tonight. Real folks with real problems who deserved honest answers. If only he knew that before he reached Ohio, he'd face a challenge that would test not just his political views, but his character in front of a plane full of strangers. The flight attendant's smile was warm as J.D. settled into seat 3A. "Coffee once we're in the air, Senator?" she asked quietly. "That would be great, thanks," J.D. replied, tucking his bag under the seat in front of him. He pulled out a dog-eared paperback, a history book he'd been trying to finish for weeks, and settled in for the short flight home. A middle-aged man in a crisp navy suit took the seat across the aisle, glancing over several times as passengers continued boarding. J.D. noticed but didn't think much of it. Being recognized happened more often these days. "Everyone please take your seats so we can prepare for departure," announced the flight attendant as the last few travelers found their spots. J.D. opened his book, but before he could find his place, the man across the aisle cleared his throat loudly. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice carrying more than necessary in a quiet cabin. "You're Senator Vance, right?" J.D. looked up and nodded politely. "Yes, that's me. Nice to meet you." The man didn't return the pleasantry. Instead, his face hardened as he adjusted his expensive-looking tie. "Interesting to see you up here in first class." Something in the man's tone made a few nearby passengers turn their heads. JD gave a small smile, hoping to keep things friendly. Long legs makes the flights a bit easier. The man wasn't satisfied with that answer. Isn't it ironic, he said, voice rising further, that someone who claims to represent working folks flies first class, while regular people back in Ohio can barely afford groceries these days? An uncomfortable silence fell over the first few rows. JD felt heat rise to his face, but kept his expression neutral. He'd faced critics before, but usually not while trapped in an airplane seat at 30,000 feet. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking, the man continued, emboldened by the attention. You talk about understanding struggle, but look at you now. He gestured at JD's seat. A flight attendant paused in the aisle, sensing tension. Everything okay here? Just having a discussion about political authenticity, the man replied before JD could speak. We're fine, thank you, JD said to the attendant with a reassuring nod. The last thing he wanted was to make a scene. As the flight attendant moved on, the businessman leaned slightly across the aisle. My brother lost his factory job last year. 22 years he worked there. Your policies haven't done anything to help people like him. JD noticed a young woman in the row behind them discreetly holding up her phone, recording the interaction. Great. This would probably be online before they even landed. Your book made you millions while telling stories about the very people you're failing now, the man added. Quite a comfortable position you've made for yourself. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably. An older woman 2 rows up turned and frowned at the man, but he didn't notice or didn't care. The plane began taxiing, the safety demonstration mercifully drawing attention away for a moment. JD stared out the window, his book forgotten in his lap. He thought about responding, defending himself, but what good would it do? The man clearly had his mind made up. We all see through the act, the man said, quieter now, but with no less intensity. The regular guy from a small-town routine. Now you're just another politician in a nice suit. That stung more than JD wanted to admit. Was that how people saw him now? Had he changed that much since coming to Washington? These were the very doubts that sometimes kept him awake at night. As the plane accelerated down the runway, JD found himself at a crossroads. He could ignore the man for the rest of the flight, switch seats if possible, or what? The easy options didn't feel right. The plane lifted off, and with it, JD felt a decision forming in his mind. This uncomfortable moment could end in many ways. It was up to him to choose which one. The seatbelt sign dinged off. JD reached for his coffee as the businessman across the aisle pulled out his phone. Mind if I take a picture, Senator? He asked, not waiting for permission before the flash went off. My buddies back home won't believe I'm sitting across from the famous JD Vance. JD forced a polite smile, though his stomach was tightening. He'd been through enough public appearances to recognize when things were about to go sideways. You know what's funny? The man continued, his voice growing louder. My dad worked 40 years in that steel mill you talk about in your speeches. 40 years. And what's his pension worth now? Practically nothing. A couple in the row ahead turned around, curiosity plain on their faces. You're nothing but a fraud, the businessman declared, pointing directly at JD. You sold out your people for political gain. The cabin grew uncomfortably quiet. JD noticed movement in his peripheral vision, more phones appearing, recording the confrontation. This was rapidly becoming the kind of viral moment that could haunt him for years. Look at him, the man said to no one in particular. Won't even defend himself because he knows I'm right. A flight attendant approached cautiously. Sir, I'm going to need you to lower your voice. We have other passengers. Don't worry, the businessman cut her off. I'm just having a conversation with our elected official here. Don't we have the right to question our representatives? The flight attendant looked uncertainly at JD, who gave a small shake of his head. Making this into an even bigger scene wouldn't help anyone. You voted against extending unemployment benefits, the businessman continued, counting off on his fingers. You opposed raising the minimum wage. You supported tax cuts for corporations, while people in your state can't afford health care. Each accusation landed like a physical blow. Some were oversimplifications, some were policies JD had actually opposed, but explaining the nuances of legislative compromise to an angry man on an airplane seemed impossible. A woman a few rows back called out, "Let him eat his breakfast in peace." But this only seemed to energize the businessman. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said sarcastically. "Is the senator uncomfortable? Try being uncomfortable when you're choosing between medicine and groceries." JD's face burned with embarrassment. He wasn't ashamed of his record. He believed in his positions and could defend them in any fair debate. But this wasn't a debate, it was a public ambush. The businessman pulled up something on his phone. "Let me read you what you said last month about personal responsibility." Easy to talk about personal responsibility when you've got a fat book deal and a Senate salary, isn't it? An elderly man in the row behind muttered, "That's enough," but his voice was too soft to carry. JD noticed a young father covering his daughter's ears a few rows away, the little girl looking confused by the tension filling the cabin. This wasn't just about him anymore. "Nothing to say, Senator," the businessman pressed, leaning further into the aisle. "Cat got your tongue? Or do you only speak when your handlers have prepared remarks for you?" JD took a slow, deep breath. He'd grown up around tough men with strong opinions. His grandfather had taught him that sometimes the strongest response wasn't the loudest one. But sitting there, being berated in front of a plane full of strangers recording every second, tested every lesson he'd ever learned about keeping his cool. The businessman finally fell silent, seemingly satisfied with the public shaming he'd delivered. The tension in the cabin remained thick enough to cut with a knife. Passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, some sympathetic toward JD, others clearly agreeing with his critic. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the steady hum of the engines as the plane cruised through clear skies. JD knew that whatever he did next would define not just this confrontation, but possibly his character in the eyes of everyone watching, both on the plane and eventually online. 5 minutes passed in uncomfortable silence. The businessman had pulled out his laptop, apparently satisfied with the damage he'd done. JD stared out the window, watching clouds drift by below them. "Coffee refill, Senator?" the flight attendant asked softly, leaning down to avoid being overheard. "No thanks," JD replied, then paused. "Actually, could you bring 2 cups? One for me and one for my friend across the aisle." The flight attendant raised her eyebrows slightly but nodded. JD took a deep breath. His mind drifted back to his childhood kitchen table, where his grandmother had taught him an important lesson after he'd gotten into a fight at school. "Fighting fire with fire just burns everything down," she'd said while pressing a bag of frozen peas to his swollen eye. Sometimes the bravest thing is to try understanding why they're so angry in the first place. The flight attendant returned with 2 steaming cups. JD thanked her and held one out toward the businessman. "Peace offering?" JD said. The man looked up, surprised. For a moment, JD thought he might refuse or even knock the cup away. Instead, after a heartbeat of hesitation, he accepted it with a curt nod. "Look," JD said, keeping his voice low enough that only the businessman could hear him clearly, "I understand you're frustrated. And you've got every right to be. But instead of us exchanging jabs for the next hour, while everyone around us feels awkward, what if we actually talked?" The businessman snorted. "What's there to talk about? Your voting record speaks for itself." "Maybe," JD acknowledged. "But there's usually more to any story than just how someone voted. I'd like to hear more about your brother who lost his job, if you're willing to share." The surprise on the man's face was evident. He'd clearly expected more defensiveness, maybe even anger. The businessman glanced around at the other passengers, some of whom were still watching them with interest. "I don't need your sympathy," he said, but the edge had softened in his voice. "Not offering sympathy," JD replied. "Offering to listen. Big difference." A child a few rows back started crying, momentarily drawing attention away from them. The businessman took a sip of his coffee and seemed to be considering the offer. "Mind if I move over?" JD asked, gesturing to the empty seat beside the man. The businessman shrugged. "It's a free country. For now, anyway." JD unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. He felt dozens of eyes on him as he stepped across the aisle. A few phones were still recording. Whatever happened next would likely end up online, for better or worse. As JD settled into the seat beside the businessman, he felt strangely calm. This wasn't a campaign event with rehearsed talking points. This wasn't a Senate debate with parliamentary rules. This was just two people from the same state with different perspectives. "I'm not asking you to change your mind about me or my policies," JD said quietly, "but I'd like to understand where you're coming from. My grandfather always said you can't solve a problem until you really understand it." The businessman studied JD's face, perhaps looking for signs of insincerity or political calculation. What he saw must have satisfied him, because he put his laptop away and turned slightly in his seat. "My brother worked at Riverside Manufacturing for 22 years, he began, his voice softer now. When they moved the plant to Mexico, he was 53 years old. Too young to retire, too old to start over." JD nodded, listening intently. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket and, after asking permission with a glance, began taking notes. Something shifted in the atmosphere between them, not friendship exactly, but a tentative bridge across a seemingly impassable divide. Around them, the tension in the cabin began to dissolve. The other passengers, sensing the confrontation had transformed into something else entirely, gradually returned to their books and screens. But a few continued to watch with interest as the senator and his critic leaned toward each other, engaged in conversation rather than conflict. 22 years is a long time to work somewhere," JD said, jotting down notes as the businessman described his brother's situation. "What kind of manufacturing was it?" "Auto parts," the man replied, his coffee now half empty. "They made brake components. Good quality stuff. My brother was a floor supervisor." JD nodded. "I know Riverside. My uncle applied there once, back when I was a kid." The businessman seemed surprised by this connection. "Really?" "Yeah. Didn't get the job though." JD smiled slightly. "He wasn't exactly what you'd call reliable back then." This drew a small chuckle from the businessman, the first crack in his stern demeanor. They had high standards. That's what made the closure so hard to swallow. They weren't failing. They were profitable. Just not profitable enough for the shareholders, I guess. A flight attendant passed by with the drink cart, pausing to check if they needed anything. Both declined. The businessman, who had introduced himself as Tom during their conversation, glanced at JD's notebook. "You actually taking notes?" he asked, sounding genuinely curious. "I am," JD replied. "Look, I can't promise I'll solve your brother's specific situation, but these stories matter. They help me understand what's really happening, not just what the statistics show." Tom grunted. "Most politicians I've met just want a photo op with real Americans before going back to their fancy fundraisers." JD put his pen down and looked directly at Tom. "Can I level with you? I don't always get it right. Sometimes I vote for bills with parts I don't like because there's something important in there that my state needs. Sometimes I have to choose between bad and worse options. The system isn't designed for perfect solutions." Tom leaned back slightly, studying JD's face. "At least that sounds honest." An elderly woman across the aisle had been listening intently. She leaned forward now. "My grandson can't afford his apartment anymore," she said. "Works full-time too." JD turned toward her. "Where does he live, ma'am?" "Columbus," she replied. "Rent went up $300 this year." A young man 2 rows ahead twisted around. "Same thing in Cincinnati. It's ridiculous." Suddenly, the conversation had expanded. A middle-aged teacher from Cleveland joined in, describing how her students' families were struggling. A nurse talked about patients rationing medication. JD listened to each person, asking questions, taking notes, his original critic now sitting beside him almost as a partner in the discussion. "See what I mean about housing costs?" Tom said, gesturing to the elderly woman. "That's exactly what my brother faced after losing his job." JD nodded. "Housing is a perfect example of a complex problem. We need more affordable units, but construction costs are up. We need better wages, but small businesses are already struggling. And any solution I propose gets labeled either socialist handouts or heartless capitalism, depending who's doing the labeling." A man in a work uniform spoke up from across the aisle. "So what would you do about it if you could wave a magic wand?" JD thought for a moment. No magic wands in politics, unfortunately. But if I could push through one thing, probably a combination of zoning reform to allow more housing density plus targeted tax incentives for middle-class home construction. He turned to Tom. but I'd also want stronger protections for workers when plants close. Your brother deserved better. Tom seemed surprised by this acknowledgement. That's not what I expected you to say. Why's that? JD asked. Because it doesn't fit neatly into the usual political boxes, Tom replied. My brother would probably appreciate hearing that actually. The conversation continued, flowing across political lines that usually divided people. What had started as a hostile confrontation had transformed into something rare in American public life, people with different views actually listening to each other, finding points of agreement amid their differences. The phones that had been recording earlier were still out, but now they were capturing something unexpected, not a politician being humiliated, but a genuine exchange of ideas between citizens with different perspectives. One young woman was typing furiously on her phone, probably posting updates to social media about the surprising turn of events unfolding in first class. As the discussion continued, JD realized this unexpected encounter might accomplish more than any carefully planned town hall ever could. So your grandmother basically raised you? Tom asked, leaning forward with genuine interest. Their conversation had evolved over the past 20 minutes, moving from policy disagreements to personal stories. She did, JD nodded. Tough as nails, that woman. Didn't take excuses from anyone, especially me. His eyes crinkled with the memory. When I was 14, I got caught skipping school. She made me scrub every floor in the house with a toothbrush. Several passengers laughed. The atmosphere in the cabin had completely transformed. My dad was the same way, Tom admitted. Strict, but fair. He always said character is what you do when nobody's watching. Smart man, JD replied. Sounds like we had similar upbringings, just different conclusions about some things. The elderly woman who had joined their conversation earlier spoke up again. That's what's missing these days, isn't it? People recognizing they can disagree without being enemies. A middle-aged man in a business suit who had been quiet until now nodded in agreement. I voted against you, Senator, he said, but I appreciate how you're handling this. Most politicians I've seen would have either ignored the criticism or called for the flight attendant. JD smiled. My grandmother would have whacked me with a wooden spoon if I'd done either of those things. More laughter rippled through the cabin. You know, Tom said thoughtfully, I still disagree with you on tax policy. I think corporations should pay more, especially after getting those big breaks a few years back. That's fair, JD replied. Where do you think that money should go if they did pay more? Tom thought for a moment. Infrastructure for one. Have you driven on some of our roads lately? And job training programs that actually lead to decent paying work. To everyone's surprise, JD was nodding. On infrastructure, we're completely aligned. I've been pushing for a bridge repair bill since I got to Washington. He pulled out his phone and showed Tom a news article about his efforts on a bipartisan infrastructure package. Huh, Tom said, clearly surprised. I hadn't heard about that. Doesn't make for exciting headlines, JD shrugged. Bridges aren't as sexy as political fights. A young woman with glasses who had been recording much of their conversation spoke up. I'm studying political science, she said. They never teach us about this part of politics, finding overlapping interests. That's because it doesn't happen enough, the elderly woman said firmly. Back in my day, politicians from different parties would fight like cats and dogs on TV, then go have dinner together. JD turned to Tom. What about your brother? What's he doing now? Tom's face clouded slightly. Driving for a delivery company. Makes about half what he used to. Still looking for something better. JD wrote something in his notebook. What skills does he have beyond his supervisory experience? He's good with machines. Can fix almost anything mechanical. JD nodded, still writing. There's a new battery plant breaking ground near Toledo. They're going to need experienced manufacturing supervisors. Would he be willing to relocate? Tom's eyebrows shot up. Possibly. That's actually helpful. No promises, JD cautioned, but I can pass his information to their hiring team. They've been asking me for recommendations on local talent. A flight attendant approached to announce they'd be beginning their descent soon. JD looked surprised. The hour had flown by. I still think you're wrong about minimum wage, Tom said, but now with a hint of a smile. And I still think your approach to corporate regulation would have unintended consequences, JD countered good-naturedly. But we both want good jobs and safe bridges. Tom extended his hand, which JD shook firmly. Never thought I'd say this, but it was good talking with you, Senator. Likewise, Tom, JD replied. And I meant what I said about your brother. Have him send his resume to my office. As they prepared for landing, JD looked around at the passengers who had participated in their impromptu forum. People from different walks of life, with different political views, had found ways to talk to each other respectfully. No minds had been completely changed, no dramatic conversions had occurred, but something perhaps more valuable had happened instead. A recognition that behind political labels were real people with shared concerns and common humanity. The plane touched down with a gentle bump. As passengers reached for their bags, the usual hurry to deplane was replaced by something unusual. People talking to each other, continuing conversations started during the flight. Senator called a woman in a blue dress as JD stood to retrieve his bag. My son just texted me. You're trending on social media. JD raised his eyebrows. That could be good or bad news. She smiled, holding up her phone. It's good, very good. Several videos had already been posted online. The initial clips showed the confrontation, Tom's angry accusations, and JD's uncomfortable expression. But the later videos told a different story. The senator sitting beside his critic, listening intently, the discussion expanding to include other passengers, moments of unexpected laughter. Watching a politician actually listen instead of just waiting for their turn to talk, read one comment with thousands of likes already. As passengers filed into the terminal, several approached KG. I didn't vote for you, said a middle-aged teacher, but you've got my attention now. A college student shook his hand. That's how debates should work. Tom lingered near the gate, seemingly unsure whether to say more. JD approached him. I meant what I said about your brother, JD said, handing Tom a business card with his office number handwritten on the back. Have him call this number directly. My staff will know to expect it. Tom tucked the card carefully into his wallet. Thanks. I still think you're wrong about plenty of things, he added with a small smile, but I appreciate you listening. The feeling's mutual, JD replied. Safe travels, Tom. As JD walked toward baggage claim, his phone buzzed continuously with messages from his staff who had clearly seen the videos. Are you okay? Read one. PR strategy for response? Asked another. He chuckled, realizing they were bracing for damage control. He typed back, all good. No statement needed. This was just citizens talking to each other. 2 weeks later, JD stood at a podium in Columbus, addressing a crowd gathered for a town hall meeting. The turnout was 3 times larger than expected, forcing organizers to move to a bigger venue at the last minute. Something happened on a flight recently that changed how I think about our political divides, JD began, telling the story of his encounter with Tom. We started as adversaries and ended finding things we agreed on, though we still differed on plenty. The audience was unusually quiet, listening intently. Tom updated me yesterday, JD continued. His brother interviewed at that battery plant and got the job. That's not a political victory for any party, it's just a good outcome for one family. He paused, looking out at the diverse crowd. But here's what I really learned. We've forgotten how to disagree properly in America. We'd forgotten that someone can be wrong about some things and still have valid points about others. We'd forgotten that listening doesn't mean surrendering. In the weeks that followed, JD referenced the airplane encounter in numerous speeches. News outlets that normally focused on partisan conflict found themselves covering a different kind of political story, one about finding common ground rather than scoring points. The videos continued circulating online, inspiring similar conversations across the country. A high school teacher in Idaho created a classroom exercise based on the exchange, teaching students how to engage respectfully with opposing viewpoints. A community group in Georgia started across the aisle dinners where people with different political views shared meals and conversation. Tom and JD stayed in occasional contact. They never became close friends or political allies, their differences were too fundamental for that. But they had discovered something important that day on the plane, beyond the labels of conservative and liberal, beyond party affiliations and voting records, was the possibility of seeing each other's humanity first. 6 months later, when a bipartisan infrastructure bill came up for vote in the Senate, it included specific provisions for worker retraining programs in manufacturing communities. In the list of acknowledgments tucked into the legislation's final pages was a small but meaningful note, inspired by conversations with everyday Americans, including Tom L. from Ohio. Sometimes the most powerful responses to conflict aren't speeches or arguments or clever retorts. Sometimes the most powerful response is simply the courage to listen.